Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the long overdue need to reform the mineral law of 1872, and on H.R. 2579, we're going to hear Chairman Grijalva's Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act of 2019. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and to the ranking minority member or their designee. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank you for traveling so far today to be before us. The mining law of 1872 is one of the most obsolete laws that are still on the books. It comes to us from a time when a time of the Wild West, when the Civil War veterans would head west and try to make their fortunes with a pick, a shovel, a donkey, and a dream. But there are no more picks and shovels or donkeys in today's mining. Instead, there are earth-moving trucks weighing over 350 tons and standing nearly 3 stories tall. And the dreams are those of CEOs in boardrooms in Vancouver, in Sydney, and Santiago, Chile. In 1872, land was plentiful and cheap, and President Ulysses S. Grant's goal was to give it away as fast as possible and encourage people to settle the West, paying little attention to the original inhabitants of those areas. The mining law is designed to give land and minerals away for next to nothing. The operating responsibility was an afterthought if it was even considered at all. Government effectively posted a sign on our public land saying, "Free gold, free silver, free copper, free land, no royalties or cleanup required." Mining companies took advantage, extracting over $300 billion of precious metals from public land without paying a single cent in royalties to the American people, and without bothering to clean up their legacy of 500,000 abandoned mines. I'd like to say, and I'd like to introduce a little breaking news. You've heard it here first. This was done by President Ulysses Grant to settle the West, as I pointed out. This may be a surprise to everyone here in the panel and in the office, but the West has been settled. Yes, there is no more any doubt that the West has been settled. And so we now need to kind of begin to look at what we need to do now. You know, it's no surprise that mining companies do not want and oppose any reform. Who would want to give up a 147-year-old free ride? Yet, as we all know, many things have changed in the past century and a half. Hard rock mining in America now has to comply with federal land policy and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Water Act, among others. But none of these laws help land managers plan for the specific environmental challenges that come with hard rock mining, or address the exalted status that mining has managed to maintain on our public lands. 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines litter the country, posing safety threats and polluting thousands of miles of rivers and streams with toxic runoff. 50 million gallons of toxic wastewater, the equivalent of 2,000 tanker trucks, flows out of hard rock mines every single day. Congress tackled this issue for coal mines over 40 years ago. The industry was asked to pay a small fee for each ton of mined coal, and that money goes to remediating the harmful legacy of countless abandoned coal mines. There is no similar program for cleaning up abandoned hard rock mines. That can only happen if the mining industry steps up and meaningfully deals with its own long history of pollution, just as the coal industry has done. There are many ways to raise that revenue, and one option would be a long-needed and overdue royalty on hard rock mining. For nearly a century, the American people have received a royalty for oil, for gas, for coal, for potash, for soda ash, and many other resources that are extracted from public lands. It should be no different for gold, silver, copper, or any other mineral. We can establish an abandoned mine land fund so that our public lands are safe and accessible for generations to come. We can reaffirm that there are places mining shouldn't happen, where the impacts upon the public health, upon the environment, or places sacred to tribes will be too great. And we can finally get rid of this idea that mining is always the highest and best use of our public lands. The mining industry says everything is working just fine. Yet, in the same breath, they complain that the permitting system is completely broken. I say to them, that's because there is no permitting system, just modern environmental laws piled on top of a creaky, rotting, 150-year-old foundation. They will argue that we need more mines to cut our import dependence or find the minerals needed to realize our clean energy future. But they need to acknowledge that this can happen and won't happen if they insist on creating a future for mining using a relic of the distant past. The mining law of 1872 must go. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I will now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for yielding time. And thanks for all the witnesses being here today. Today we're going to consider the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act of 2019. This misinformation and misguided legislation seeks to fundamentally transform the general mining law of 1872. Specifically, this bill would convert the existing mining claim system to a leasing system and impose an 8% gross royalty on existing operations and a 12.5% gross royalty on new mining operations on federal lands. While my colleagues on the other side claim that they are simply seeking to update an outdated statute, in fact, this legislation is designed to cripple the domestic mining industry by making new and existing operations unprofitable. Without a doubt, this legislation would drive mining investment away from the U.S., furthering our dependence on foreign imports and threatening the U.S. supply chain for countless industries and products. Hard rock mining is critical to our national security, manufacturing and infrastructure sectors, and even renewable technologies. If you'll bring up slide number 1, showing the components of a cell phone here. In order to make missiles, modern weapons systems, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries for electric vehicles, smartphones, tablets, and even smart home devices, you must first mine and process hard rock minerals. For example, electric vehicles require large amounts of lithium, cobalt, graphite, and copper. Presently, the United States is dependent on foreign imports for each of these minerals. Would you please show slide number 2? According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. is currently 100% import reliant on 18 minerals and more than 50% reliant on another 30 minerals. Please push slide 3. Look at the desponding change. As you see here, we have greatly increased our dependency on foreign minerals, particularly from China, which has happened over the last 2 decades. In the previous slide, if you looked at, can I go back to the previous slide? Way down at the very bottom, it shares the rare earths. This is one of our technology marvels that we need. It's a 2% that we were reliant on everybody else. Now let's go back to the previous slide. It's 100%. China dictates the whole marketplace. That's why you've seen batteries move over to China. They dictate the whole process in this aspect. We are import reliant for 14 of the 15 minerals required in most renewable energy technologies, and demand will soon outpace supply. Just last week at a conference here in DC, Tesla warned that a lack of investment in the mining sector is creating a shortage of key minerals needed to build electric vehicles. My colleagues say that the mining law is antiquated and that companies are free to mine anywhere they like without paying their fair share. However, hard rock mining must comply with the same environmental statutes and regulations as all other industries. In fact, the general mining law has been amended several times to require additional environmental protections and establish fees for mining claims. In addition to state and local laws, hard rock mining operations must comply with at least 36 federal environmental laws and regulations, including FLPMA, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, just to name a few. Each of these laws ensures that mining operations protect public health, safety, as well as the environment. Now, while my colleagues are quick to claim that this industry can mine on our federally owned land free of charge, that is not the case. In fiscal year 2017, the industry paid $65 million in mining claim fees and 40 to 50% of all earnings in taxes, fees, and state royalties. My colleague's proposal to convert the current claim system to a leasing system would drive away investment from the domestic mining industry. Under a leasing system, the federal government can cancel a lease for political reasons, even after significant upfront investment has been made in exploration and before any resources have been recovered. In fact, that's actually trying to happen right now. My colleagues on the other side are trying to dispute a claim that's already been settled. Hard rock mining exploration involves significant financial risk, as it can take decades to locate a deposit that is economical to mine. According to the USGS, only 1 in 1,000 potential targets for a mining operation actually become a mine. The average timeline from concept to discovery is 10 years, and the average permitting timeline is 7 to 10 years. Under this legislation, a company would need to negotiate renewal of the lease before permitting has even concluded, given that the average upfront investment before mining even begins is $244 million. The arbitrary lease renewable requirements would be undoubtedly curtail investment in any new mines. Because most of the $244 million is spent on environmental compliance, imposing a system that encourages companies to race towards production under the new threat of a lease cancellation, that would pose a greater risk to the environment. Further, the royalty rates suggested in this draft legislation are designed not to generate fair return to the taxpayers, but to put the domestic mining industry out of business. Under this legislation, there would be no mining industry to pay for the abandoned mine cleanup. At a time when we are facing shortfalls in critical minerals like lithium and copper, we should be focusing on streamlining the permitting process to bolster domestic production, not enacting legislation that can put the U.S.-based industry out of business. The foolish policies in this legislation would only further exacerbate our reliance on China and other nations for minerals we need for our economic and national security. Before I turn back over the mic, I have several things that I want to submit for the record. We have the mining future from MP that be submitted into the record. We also have a summary from Tesla to be submitted into the record.
So ordered, so ordered.
I also have a letter from the Arizona Chamber of Commerce to hand out. This would have an impact of $4.29 billion, and 44,000 direct and indirect jobs will be associated with impact because of this job. I'd like to have that submitted for the record.
It will be submitted for the record.
I would like to have the timeline in regards to what it takes, hard rock mining timeline for before production to be placed in the record.
So ordered.
I also have China resource strategy, the extorsive aspect in which China One Belt, One Road is dominating all resources around the world and where they're at, for the record.
So ordered.
I thank the chairman and yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to now ask you, yes, I'm going to ask unanimous consent for Congressman Amadei and Congressman Stauber to sit on the dais and participate in this morning's hearing. Hearing no objections, it's been so ordered. I'm now going to introduce today's witnesses. First, we have the Honorable Edward Manuel, Chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Next, we have Mr. Colin Davis, owner of Chico Hot Springs Resort, and a member of the Yellowstone Gateway Business Coalition. Next, we have Ms. Gwen Lackelt, County Commissioner of La Plata County, Colorado. And finally, Mr. Robert Comer, partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow, and then your time will have then expired when the red light comes on, and that will be within 1 minute later. And I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. Let's begin, and the chair now recognizes Chairman Manuel to testify.
Good morning, Chairman Loventhal, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Gozar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Edward D. Emanuel, and I'm Chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation, a federally recognized tribe with more than 34,000 members located in southern and central Arizona. As the subcommittee is likely aware, mining has caused much turmoil throughout Indian country. Mining has generated untold amounts of pollution, destroyed natural resources, and caused untold amounts of health care issues. These problems have been aided by the 1872 mining law. It is time for reform. The 1872 mining law has adversely affected the Tohono O'odham Nation in many ways. I would like to address 3 today. First, our mineral resource program oversees Freeport McMoran mine in the northern part of the reservation, as well as an Asarco mine located on our reservation near Tucson. These operations were permitted under an old system where mining companies could claim minerals underneath our lands without our consent. The 1872 mining law has no environmental standards, and so these mines were allowed to generate pollution that impacted our lands and waters. The Freeport McMoran mine has generated pollution that has infiltrated the underground aquifer. The pollution is thought that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has designated it as an alternative Superfund site. The Asarco mine was able to operate from 1957 to 2001 without a mine plan of operation. It took years of legal wrangling from the nation to be able to better assure environmental protection in and around the Asarco mine. If the proposed reforms were in place where the mine started, or when the mine started, we could have alleviated much of this heartache. Second, the current system has divided mineral rights throughout our reservation lands in the United States among a patchwork of patented, unpatented, public, and allotted lands. The patented mining claims in particular are a great source of pain for the nation. There are dozens of patented mining claims throughout the nation. This makes pockets of land throughout the nation that we do not have control of. As a result, we still devote some of our financial and administrative resources to buying back mineral rights privatized under the antiquated statute. If the proposed reforms were in place, it is likely the nation would not have lost so much control of its land. Finally, the 1872 mining law threatens our natural resources near the reservation. Hart Bay is seeking to open the Rosemont mine in the Santa Rita Mountains outside of Tucson. The U.S. Forest Service approved the mine without meaningful tribal consultation. Instead, the Forest Service ignored its authority to protect cultural resources on public lands where there was no discovery of a valuable mineral deposit. Again, if the proposed reforms were in place, we would have had a seat at the table to allow our concerns to be meaningfully considered. Reform of the 1872 mining law will help prevent the pollution of our lands and waters by providing an independent, dedicated funding source for the cleanup of abandoned mines. Revenues from this reclamation fee could be distributed to our mining or mineral resource program and potentially used to employ our nation's members, not just in mining operations, but also in reclamation projects. It will also permanently end patenting. This privatization of minerals underneath our reservation provides just another way to take our lands from us. Most importantly, this reform respects tribal sovereignty with the consultation process where federal agencies receive input from tribes. But I must make clear that this will be for naught if the federal agencies do not proactively take steps to avoid and minimize impacts to cultural resources. Finally, this reform clarifies the authority of both tribal governments and the federal government to balance mining with other competing land uses. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you. For the above reasons, I respectfully ask for your support of this important mining reform legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Manuel. The chair now recognizes Mr. Davis to testify for 5 minutes.
I would like to thank the chairman and the entire committee for inviting me to speak today on behalf of the urgent need to reform the 1872 mining law in order to protect our nation's resources, our free competition, and above all, our communities. I have had the privilege of testifying before this committee in 2018 while I was fighting for my own home, my own way of life. Today, I feel I'm doing the same for my country. I sit here today as a founding member of the Yellowstone Gateway Business Coalition, also as a business owner and a proud steward of Montana's Paradise Valley. Not unlike Yellowstone National Park, the Paradise Valley is one of God's greatest creations. From the majestic mountains and the flowing river to the thriving ranches, our outdoor lifestyle is clearly abundant. It's where my wife, my daughters and I, we hike, we hunt, we fish, we recreate. My daughter's here today, she can testify to all of those. More importantly, it's the gateway to Yellowstone National Park, which draws visitors from around the country, but also, as you know, from around the world, and it drives our local economy. Paradise Valley is as fruitful for commerce as it is for recreation. Our family business, Chico Hot Springs Resort, has thrived for 120 years, primarily thanks to the wonders of the surrounding landscapes. Our family works extremely hard, and we take immense pride in preserving the springs and our legacy, and we love to share them with others. It's hard work and independence that are a way of life, but it's also a Montana ethic and a Montana way of life. The other businesses surrounding Yellowstone are equally committed to preserving this place. To that end, over 400 businesses and stakeholders banded together in a successful effort to fight one of the greatest threats our region had ever faced. We stood together to prevent 2 industrial-scale gold mines from ripping apart our valley, our land, our life, and our businesses, and it was all being done without giving our community a say in the future of these lands, in the future of our own backyard. We formed this coalition based on 3 principles. It was formed on pro-business, pro-mining, and pro-property rights. We support development, including mining, when it's done right, and it's good for our community. When it's not done right, it should be our right and is our right to oppose it. The mines would have had a dramatic and negative impact on our already flourishing regional economy. It's important to underscore we're not anti-mining, and this is one of our core principles. We understand the West is rich in extractable minerals, which can be vital to parts of the economy. Our membership includes miners. Mining, like all industries, like my own, can be done well or it can be done poorly. We also believe in property rights. That being said, mining even on public lands can unjustly damage private business interests. We as the public should have a loud voice in what happens to our public lands, especially when they're local. Our principles are consistent with individual liberty and free enterprise, which our nation values so highly. The tenet of free enterprise should give us a voice in managing, not wasting these natural resources. What I'm sharing with you is nothing new, but our community chose to stand and fight together. It's why our region is now protected from industrial-scale mining via the Gateway Protection Act, which passed in recent public lands package. It was no easy feat. Our coalition spent over 4 years, money we didn't have, money we couldn't afford, and countless hours away from our homes and our families, simply to fight foreign corporations that stood to profit from legal loopholes in our own law, and it would have been at our expense. Fortunately, we were successful, but many communities and businesses across the West are facing similar fights. Today's problems with the 1872 mining law weren't always problems. In 1872, it made sense to encourage Americans to go west and incentivize them to dig, but today it really doesn't. The world has changed dramatically in 147 years, but this law simply hasn't. The law gives hard rock mining a very unfair advantage in multiple ways. It creates externalities and stifles competition. It gives mining companies a free pass to mine without paying royalties that other extractive industries such as coal and oil have to pay. The law especially declares mining the best use of public lands with zero cost-benefit analysis. This special treatment frustrates fair competition. Finally, hard rock mining does pump more pollution than any other source, according to the EPA. This means the industry placing the biggest boot on the taxpayer's back also leaves the biggest footprint on the land. The way forward, to me, is clear, and it's simple. Stop subsidies, make companies pay royalties, ensure companies pay for cleanup, and above all, let land managers and local communities choose the true best use of those public lands. In conclusion, I'd like to say that while it was a real honor to be one of the leaders of the Yellowstone Gateway Business Coalition and an honor to win this fight, I would have much rather been at home running my own business and spending the last 4 years with my family. I hope Congress can find the same bipartisan path it did with the lands package in updating this law. Our lives, our businesses, and our communities should be ours to control and care for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lackalt to testify for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. My name is Gwen Lackalt. I'm a county commissioner from La Plata County, Colorado. In 2015, polluted water spilled out of the Gold King mine, turning the Animas River, the lifeblood of our corner of southwest Colorado, a toxic orange. 3 million gallons of acidic waste laden with arsenic, lead, and other harmful contaminants spilled out of the inactive gold mine, flowing directly into the Animas River. The people of southwest Colorado rely on the river for drinking water, to irrigate fields, to sustain wildlife, and to support a lucrative outdoor recreation industry. 1872 mining law reform and the reclamation fund it would create would help communities like mine clean up the hundreds of thousands of abandoned hard rock mines that litter the West. To date, there is still no comprehensive inventory of abandoned hard rock mines, no system to prioritize cleanup of the most dangerous of these mines, and almost no funds to pay for it. According to the EPA, estimated cleanup costs are around $50 billion. La Plata County is not alone in feeling the impacts of abandoned mines. The hard rock mining industry is the country's largest source of toxic pollution, according to the EPA's toxic release inventory. And because the 150-year-old mining law continues to govern in the 21st century, both abandoned and operating mines leave behind environmental, public health, and economic devastation that taxpayers must pay for and communities must endure. Just last week, the Blue River that runs through Breckenridge, Colorado, turned orange because of recent precipitation that mobilized the runoff from an abandoned mine upstream. One of the biggest concerns following the river's dramatic change in color last weekend has been about the safety of drinking water supplies, given that hundreds of thousands of people in Colorado rely on Dillon Reservoir, which is downstream from the pollution. Communities across the country rely on their rivers the way we rely on the Animas. Our health and prosperity depend on clean water. Reforming the 1872 mining law to bring it into the modern age can help us clean up old mines and safeguard our precious water resources from future mine disasters. The time to change U.S. mining policy is long overdue. The general mining law that governs today's mining industry was signed into law more than 147 years ago when miners worked with picks and shovels, a far cry from the modern mines that can decimate entire watersheds. We have an opportunity to make sure there is never another Gold King mine spill. By reforming the 1872 mining law, we not only create a robust reclamation fund to clean up old mines, but we also create jobs. An abandoned mine reclamation program with a significant dedicated funding source can act as an economic driver. Across the country, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act's abandoned mine program has reclaimed over $5.7 billion worth of mine pollution and nearly 800,000 acres of damaged land and water. This work cannot be outsourced. The program delivered a total impact of $778 million to the U.S. economy in fiscal year 2013 and supported 4,761 jobs across the country, 1,317 of which were Central Appalachian states. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that for each $1 million spent on mine cleanup, 14 to 33 new jobs are created. In Ohio, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act funds generated 10 jobs per $1 million invested. Between 2008 and 2013, federal funding to the AML program generated more than $1.8 million in Ohio state and local tax revenue. Stream restoration has a positive impact as well. In West Virginia, estimated benefits from restoration of Deckers Creek total about $1.9 million annually. Without 1872 mining law reform, we simply don't have enough money to pay for mine cleanup and spill prevention for the hundreds of thousands of abandoned and inactive mines that litter our country. The public and the environment have paid the price for too long. Western communities and water resources need Congress to act now to protect our important water resources. Thank you very much.
And we thank you, Ms. Lackald. The chair now recognizes Mr. Comer to testify for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members. I am Bob Comer, a mining and environmental lawyer and a former associate and regional solicitor for the Department of the Interior. My career has been devoted to the conservation and protection of sensitive resources in the environment and the advancement of mineral and other land uses. My comments are supplemented by written testimony. The general mining law, as amended, governs how U.S. citizens may gain access to hard rock minerals so important to our economy, renewable energy future, and daily lives. No modern city, home, factory, computer, telephone, solar panel, train, plane, or automobile or national defense system can be built without minerals. The proposed legislation will harm our nation by severely limiting access and tenure to minerals at a time when the national agenda demands more. Because renewable energy cannot be achieved without minerals, the proposed legislation is inconsistent with the country's renewable energy expansion objectives. Solar panels, EV cars, rechargeable batteries, and wind turbines require an array of hard rock minerals. Smartphones require over 40 minerals. Just last week, the World Bank Group launched its Climate Smart Mining Initiative that focused on mining's indispensable role in renewables. It showed an alarming reliance on foreign minerals, including 14 of the 15 minerals identified as essential for renewables. The world would demand the same amount of copper in the next 25 years as has been mined over the last 500 years. Yet our dependence on many essential minerals has greatly increased over the past 20 years despite our substantial mineral wealth. The sweeping changes proposed to the mining law are unwarranted given how little federal land is used for hard rock mineral activities. There are about 350,000 active mining claims, with roughly half being in Nevada, which is less than 1% of the lands with our nation's mineral wealth. And only 313,000 mineral acres have been authorized for surface disturbance. When viewed in perspective, this far-reaching proposed legislation is grossly out of proportion to mining's very minor impact on federal lands. Self-initiation allows U.S. citizens to locate mining claims on federal lands to explore for minerals with the hope of discovery. The National Academy of Sciences estimates that 1,000 mineral targets must be evaluated to discover just one deposit. These are daunting odds. Self-initiation leverages private investment to finance the costly geophysical and drilling programs at no risk or expense whatsoever to U.S. taxpayers. Mines can only be developed where the minerals exist. The irony of this legislation is that it would cloak a functioning mining law in a century-old leasing system. The proposed leasing program is fraught with problems. It will precipitate the forfeiture of private property rights. It will cause a premature shutdown of mines. In Nevada alone, several large mining companies operate numerous mines that exceed the acreage limitations contained in this legislation. This will create a substantial impact and burden on many communities and the country. One of the stated drivers for the proposed legislation is to create mechanisms to say no to mining, in other words, to leave more mineral in the ground. There is no need for another law to put federal lands off limits to mining, as nearly 50% of the federal mineral estate already is off limits to mining. The new suitability provisions would prohibit mining. They're unnecessary. They eliminate the balance that the federal land management and environmental laws create, and they elevate virtually all other uses over mining. Congress has amended the mining law many times over the years to responding to evolving environmental and land management requirements. Any hard rock royalty must promote a fair return to the public while ensuring the viability of hard rock mining on federal lands, which the proposed royalty does not achieve. Modeling a hard rock royalty after coal, oil, gas programs does not consider the differences that exist between these minerals, from exploration through processing. Finally, the royalty and dirt taxes revenues are illusory because the royalty base will be dramatically reduced due to the many onerous provisions in the proposed legislation. Congress should consider policies that encourage responsible mineral exploration and development to discover the domestic minerals needed for American security and society. Amending the mining law to provide a fair return to the public while preserving certainty, land tenure, and private investment for finding, developing, and producing domestic minerals would be an important step towards energy independence and a clean energy future and a stronger America. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. I'd like to thank the panel for your testimony, and I want to remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. I'm now going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I recognize first Representative Cunningham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Thank you for traveling to testify. And it might be surprising that anyone from South Carolina would care much about a bill that deals largely with gold and copper mining on federal lands. I mean, you would think that that's just an issue for Nevada, right? Except that it's not. I had my staff look into it, and we found at least 3 hard rock mining Superfund sites in the state of South Carolina. And it's possible that there are responsible parties that are paying for the cleanup of all 3 of these, but it's also possible that they're not, and the taxpayers of South Carolina will be forced to foot that bill. Either way, the point is that abandoned hard rock mines are not simply a Western issue. They're an American issue. And a little over 40 years ago, Congress came together on a bipartisan basis to create a program, the Abandoned Mine Land Program, to deal with abandoned coal mines. And Congress rightly acknowledged that the industry had a responsibility, a duty, to help address the environmental and safety hazards that it had spent well over a century creating. We can do the same thing for hard rock mines as well. Every state has them from coast to coast, but unlike coal mines, states get virtually no money from the federal government to help clean them up. Citizens of every state deserve to not be exposed to the toxic remains of old mines. These sites need to be cleaned up faster and with less of a burden on the taxpayers. And this isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This is about fairness, it's about health, it's about the safety, and issues that are priorities for both sides of the aisle. So I want to thank Chairman Grijalva for introducing this bill. I want to thank Chairman Lowenthal for holding this hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses, again, for taking the time to be here and explain their views on this very important and critical issue. And with that, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Cunningham. I'd now like to recognize Representative Hearn for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, and our witnesses for being here today to testify. Hard rock mining provides essential materials that are used in several industries across the country, including much of our high-tech equipment. However, the majority of our supply of critical minerals come from abroad, mostly from China. Because of this, any restriction on our ability to mine these materials would hamper our industries and their growth and make us reliant on foreign materials. Mr. Comer, as someone who's considered a leading authority in natural resource permitting and compliance issues, and your testimony today, I'd like to just ask you, it's going to be a pretty short answer, I would think, but I would like to get to my colleague here from the mining world. Would you agree that this bill will have a huge negative effect on the mining industry in the United States and gravely impacting our ability to develop renewable energy sources, and in fact, driving the Green New Deal cost even higher than the ridiculous estimates of $93 trillion that are already being accepted across the industry?
Would you like an answer as simple as absolutely?
Absolutely. You can expound a little bit.
Well, the impacts and the implications will be several-fold. It will greatly impede existing mines, their continuation, their operation, and their development. And it will impair the ability to acquire new mineral resources. And the United States has substantial mineral wealth. One of the things that we haven't heard about today is some of the differences in mining today versus 100 years ago. I look at the mural in the room, and that's a technology for a bygone era.
Mr. Comer, I'm gonna ask you to hold the rest of that thought. I got a feeling you're gonna be asking a few more questions. I want to yield the balance of my time to my colleague from a mining part of the country.
Thank you, Congressman Hearn, for giving me some of your time. Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar, mining defines Minnesota's past, present, and its future. So I appreciate this opportunity to appear on this panel because I fear these proposed hard rock mining reforms would disincentivize any mining and irreversibly damage Minnesota's economy. The first bill I introduced, the Superior National Forest Land Exchange Act, it codifies the land transfer that occurred last July between the Forest Service and Polymet Mining. This bill passed the House last Congress under my predecessor, former Representative Rick Nolan's leadership, with broad bipartisan support, including, Mr. Chairman, your support, along with 4 other Democrats sitting on this subcommittee. Mr. Comer, thank you for appearing today to discuss this crucial issue involving Minnesota. The Iron Range in my district produces the iron ore used to build America and helped us win World War II. The economy on the range is volatile. It ebbs and flows with the price of steel and is constantly threatened by cheap iron ore from international competitors lacking any environmental or labor standards. Mr. Comer, how would instituting the proposed royalty and shift to a leasing system affect iron ore mining and steel production?
It would have a major devastating effect on the ability to acquire new sources of iron ore in the Rocky Mountain West. And to this date, there still are no mines that have been developed under a leasing system in the upper Midwest. So these are different types of properties, the existing industry and the new industry where it's developed with more federal mineral. But haven't developed yet. We're still trying to, after years and years of permitting and compliance activities.
Thank you. Along with iron ore, there are 2 proposed copper and nickel projects in northeastern Minnesota. The Polymet project surpassed all environmental standards, taking an incredible 14 years. Other countries mining copper and nickel have very little to no environmental standards. Mr. Comer, how can places like northeastern Minnesota compete internationally under this proposed legislation?
It would be very difficult, both in Minnesota and throughout the West. Land tenure, mineral tenure will be lost. It will be devastating, and I'm not a sky is falling type person.
Neither am I. Thank you for answering those questions, Mr. Coma, and for your testimony. And my next question will be to Commissioner Lackalt. Commissioner, I appreciate your service as a county commissioner. I, too, came from the county commissioner realm, so I appreciate what you're doing and understand what you're going through. And thank you for testifying today. You listed clean, renewable energy as a priority, and continued energy diversification requires elements like copper, nickel, and iron ore. I want to ask you this. Would you rather power your county with elements harvested in places like northern Minnesota, who have strict environmental and great union labor standards? Or would you prefer to receive these elements from places that lack union labor and environmental standards like Brazil, China, and Russia?
Sir, thank you for the question. And I think it's really important to honor the past. Our mining history in my part of the world is we honor how our region came to be and the economy that it helped build, but we need to look to the future. And we work with a lot of solar companies in our region.
Commissioner, I have to yield my time back to Representative Hearn.
Yeah, you'll get your opportunity
Thank you, Mr.
again.
Chairman.
You'll be next,
Appreciate it.
Mr.
Yield back.
Stauber. But no filibusters. Next, I'd like to recognize Congresswoman DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to welcome my homies, Commissioner Lackelt and also Mr. Comer from Colorado. And I want to apologize for toggling in and out. In the other subcommittee on this full committee, we're having a hearing down the hall on wildfires, another huge issue for our state. So I really want to thank you for coming. I want to start with you, Commissioner Lackelt, about the issue of cleanup of abandoned mines, because as you know, Colorado has one of the largest inventories of abandoned hard rock mines, and we were surely reminded of that when we had the Gold King mine blowout in 2015. We all saw those pictures that turned the rivers bright yellow and released about 3 million gallons of toxic waste water. And in the meantime, according to an AP report from February, abandoned mining sites like Gold King are leaking 50 million gallons every single day into streams, rivers, lakes, and groundwater supplies. And that's just from the sites that the AP looked at. So that's a floor and not a ceiling. I want to ask you, Ms. Lackelt, as a county commissioner of southwestern Colorado, I know you've done a lot of wonderful work advocating the cleanup of these hard rock mines. Can you tell me what we know about the scale of the problem? What's the estimated cost for this cleanup?
Thank you, Representative DeGette. It's estimated that there are over 500,000 abandoned mines that across the country, and the EPA estimates that cleanup costs could come in somewhere around $50 billion.
$50 billion.
Yes.
And where's that money going to come from to clean up those mines?
From the taxpayers.
Right. And I mean, do you think that if we don't have a dedicated hard rock abandoned mine land fund, we could ever come close to cleaning up this scale of contamination?
We need a dedicated source of funding in order to do this cleanup.
Yeah, we can't do it without it, I don't think.
Exactly.
So let me turn to you, Mr. Davis, because you know, one of the features of the mining law of 1872 is that a company can freely mine on federal lands, extract the minerals it wants, and then it doesn't have to clean up after itself or pay a royalty to American taxpayers. In your testimony, you identified the lack of royalties as one of the biggest problems with the mining law of 1872. Do you think it's fair as a small businessman that hard rock mining companies don't pay any royalties for mining federal lands?
I don't think it's fair at all. I think it sets up a great inequality. I think there's so many other industries such as oil and gas that do, but so does logging, so does agriculture. In my craft, there's so many standards I have to meet and so many regulations I have to meet, and they're all their costs to me. And when those costs change, I adapt my business to manage those costs. And traditionally, most industries pass those costs along to consumers,
Right.
you know.
So, I mean, it's oil, gas, coal, solar, wind, livestock, logging, and outdoor recreation all pay to use the public lands, but mining does not.
That's
Does
correct.
that seem fair to you?
No, it doesn't
Yeah.
seem fair.
And how does that impact taxpayers like you?
We end up carrying the burden, and especially in a situation such as the one we faced in Montana, where the two corporations, one Australian and one Canadian, were coming over the border to start industrial-scale gold mines. And the impact of that, it was going to devastate our local economy. So who picks up that cost? Who picks up the cost of my business or our entire valley? Our region has $1 billion industry employing 13,000 people. You know, I listened to the gentleman to my left talk about the national agenda, and I'm curious where the national agenda forgets about local communities and our ability to talk about what happens in our neighborhood. And we talk about necessary imports, talking about gold mining specifically
Right.
in my region and the impact of that. It would be devastating. It would decimate my industry.
So
which-
it decimates your industry, and plus we don't have the ability to clean up some of these most of these abandoned mines. Mr. Chairman, this is why we need to update this law, and I appreciate you having this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now we return once more to Representative Stober.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, I appreciate it. I want to continue my conversation, but I want to restate the question, and Commissioner Lockhart, it'll just be a yes or no answer, because I've got other questions. As you said, I'm going to ask this, would you rather power your county with elements harvested in places like northeastern Minnesota, with great EPA environmental standards and union labor, or would you prefer to receive them from places with an utter lack of labor standards and environmental standards, such as Brazil, China, or Russia? And that's just an either-or.
Thank you, Representative. I prefer that any minerals are responsibly sourced, and so I would say yes to your question and let you know that I work with solar.
Yes to harvest them in Minnesota or other
Where there
countries?
are apparently, and I'm taking, you represented that you have strong standards, and I would say I would much prefer that than from.
Much prefer Minnesota?
I would.
Thank you.
However, many of the companies
That's all-
operating on our public lands
That's all I
are
needed.
foreign companies.
I'm going to go to my next question. I appreciate you supporting my great state of Minnesota. Mr. Comer, how long does the permitting process take for hard rock operations, and how does that compare to mining in other countries with comparable environmental standards?
Thank you for the question. If you were to look at other countries, thank you for the question. Other countries such as Australia and Canada have very strong environmental laws, and they take 2 to 3 years to permit mines and properties and projects just as complicated as those that we permit here. One of the problems with the law as proposed is it adds new layers of NEPA analysis in the leasing decisions as the federal government chooses which land should be available and should not be available for further exploration after having removed 50% of those lands from availability. In the United States, a typical mine project, hard rock mining project, takes right around 10 years plus or minus.
Next question, how would you characterize the environmental protections in the United States compared to other major producers of critical minerals in the world, such as China?
The United States has top-of-class environmental protections. To say that there are no controls over how mines are developed or operated is just a simple fallacy. Part of the reason it takes 10 years is because of the 40-plus environmental and land management laws that have to be complied with. No mine's going to open today that will discharge air or water emissions that violate the law. Our protections are very strong.
As they should.
as they should be.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you for those questions. I just want to, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar, I want you to know, and other members of this panel, I want you to know how important mining is to the state of Minnesota and this nation. The critical elements that we mine, copper and nickel, we need mining to transition into alternate sources of energy. Windmills, thousands of pounds of copper. It can be mined in northern Minnesota, following strict standards, good-paying jobs, and it will be a great part of our economy. We have permitted the very first copper-nickel mine in the state of Minnesota that has met or exceeded every environmental standard. And we're going to bring great-paying jobs to this state. It's called the Duluth Complex. It's the biggest precious metals find in the world, and we can mine it safely, following standards, bringing great-paying jobs to our community. And we talk about reclamation. I would invite anybody to come up to northern Minnesota's Iron Range. I'll show you reclamation, how it should be done. We have deer, we're harvesting hay, we have bees, we have ducks, we have birds. It's beautiful. Mr.
Would
Chair,
the gentleman yield for a second?
gentleman will yield.
Would the gentleman answer me a question? The cleanest water in Minnesota is located where?
In the Iron Range,
In Reclaim Mines, is it not?
that's correct.
I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chair, that's all I have. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Chairman Grijalva, Chairman of the Resources Committee, and also the sponsor of H.R. 2579, the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act of 2019.
Well, let me first thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member, for having the hearing. It's a very important hearing, and the issue of reforming the 1872 mining law will no doubt, as this legislation proceeds, be a source of debate, to say the least. But it's a necessary debate that we need to have, and I appreciate Chairman Lowenthal, you scheduling this meeting, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here. For a decade now in southern Arizona, the Rosemont mine has been a point of opposition by vast majority of the community, and yet 10 years later, you know, as Chairman Manuel said, the permits continue to be issued, have been issued for it, and you know the litigation continues in all the various courts around there. It seems that litigation is the last stop, and regardless of the impacts on environment, water quality, sacred sites, the opposition of the Pasquayaki tribe, the Hopi tribe, the O'odham tribe, Tohono O'odham tribe, the mine has been permitted. And that is because the land managers repeat that they, under the mining law of 1872, they are not allowed to turn down a mine regardless of impact. And their ability to say no is non-existent. And I think that much of the controversy around the issue of mining and where it should be and where it shouldn't be rests with that clause and that particular power that has been given to the mining industry. And we're not talking about the little guy with his donkey going up the hill, somebody grub-staked him for him to go look for a precious metal, gold or silver. We're talking about multinational industry, particularly companies from Canada and Australia that were mentioned as being on the cutting edge of environmental protections. I want to ask you, in one aspect of this whole discussion, Chairman Manuel, the O'odham Nation has long dealt with the impacts, as you mentioned in your statement, of mining on your lands. Could you tell us the impacts to your land and water? Elaborate a little more regarding Freeport, the Freeport and Asarco mines, Mr. Chairman?
Well, thank you for the question, Chairman Grijalva. When the mine was put in place on the nation back in the 1950s by Hecla Mining Company at that time, which was from Canada, And then they started mining, and it's up on a mound, and there's communities below those mounds. They started mining underground the oxide and sulfide, and they started putting in acid underground. That acid got into the water, underground water, and started traveling and got to the communities there. Right now, EPA is involved as far as the cleanup, and it's a super fund. And so we have monitoring wells around the area, and the contamination is still moving away from the mine. So that's our major concern.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think the point that the chairman made as well, I think should not be ignored, that the lack of consultation on the part of the federal government with regard to a federal asset with the trust responsibility to consult in a meaningful and real way with tribes before the fact, not after the fact. And I think the chairman pointed that out. Mr. Davis, I was gonna, your situation is very similar to the one that we're dealing with in Arizona. You fought proposed mines at the doorstep of the Yellowstone,
That's correct.
and people are fighting to keep the Grand Canyon free from uranium mining within close to Grand Canyon, an iconic treasure. And you mentioned also, and it was part of the overall lands package, that that it was approved into law to create a buffer around that your organization fought so hard for, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle supported, to create a buffer next to Yellowstone from mining, effectively banning mining from that area in order to conserve and protect that. I find that interesting because I'm sure there'll be oppositions to any kinds of equal protections in other parts of the country, which is the other legislative tool that we have here in Congress to stop that. And I congratulate your group in doing that and getting that done and convincing your elected officials to respond to that. These mines in Yellowstone, are devastating to business. Could you elaborate on that? What would have happened? Employment, revenue, local tax base, et cetera.
Just my valley alone sees $70 million a year in tourist business based on fishing, but the region itself sees almost $1 billion, and again, it drives 13,000 different jobs. So I have to underscore, this is not about being anti-mining, and I certainly appreciate the gentleman from Minnesota. Montana is laden with extractable minerals. It's what we're going to mine, how we're going to mine, and where we're going to mine it. And our big contention is that communities should have a very loud say in whether that is the place that's going to happen, instead of having a golden ticket to come into your community, especially as a foreign corporation, and set up shop without any penalties or without any respect to the community and its way of life and what does drive that economy. Their right certainly should not supersede a right that's been entrenched for 100 years. My business is 120 years old. I have my life on the line. I have my family's life on the line. So the impact of especially with today's technology and today's machinery, to come in 3 miles from the highway, the corridor to Yellowstone, and start open pit mining, it would devastate our economy. It would really, you'd be trading one for another.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. I now recognize Representative Amadei for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the committee for its courtesies in allowing me to participate in a hearing for an industry that's fairly important in my district. First of all, I'd like to ask anybody on the panel if you have any familiarity with the state of hard rock mining in Nevada. And if so, please raise your hand and tell me what that is. Mr. Comer.
Thank you. I have visited mines in in Nevada, and am familiar with gold mining in Nevada. In addition, I reviewed and some efforts in mine transactions between companies, many mines in Nevada.
Okay, and I appreciate that. Anybody else? Okay, and it's not that I expected you to, or that's a wrong answer or anything like that, but I want to use my time to kind of, in keeping with the theme of the hearing, talk about reforming the mining law of 1872, because anything with the date of 1872 suggests that perhaps it's time to take a look at that and update things. That's not a wild thought, and I support that. But the challenge before us in doing that is doing that with an open mind, and doing that with your head on a swivel, and doing that with a mind to all things relevant, whether that's tax, whether that's permitting, whether it's all those things. And let me just state so it's clear, it's time. We should take a look at that, and we should do some reforms. But as we do that, we need to take a look at how things are going, and I'm not going to tell you how things are in your jurisdictions or things like that, but I do know some things about what's going on in my jurisdiction. And in my jurisdiction, when we talk about what are we going to do, for instance, for taxing those federal lands, which most of the mining takes place on, it's like, fair enough, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how mining in Nevada pays over $15,000 an employee in state, local, and federal taxes. The next closest industry is about $1,100. Now, that doesn't mean those industries are bad industries. It just means that we shouldn't start, at least in that neck of the woods, on federal land with the premise that it's not paying its way. Let's talk about a living wage in Nevada, because guess what? If you pay high wages, you also pay federal income taxes. And so when we talk about wages in the hard rock mining industry in my state, those people can afford their food, they can afford their health care, they can afford their medical care, they can afford all those things because they're paid very well. And let's talk about their impact on public safety, because it's funny, those companies, before they turn you loose on their sites or underground, tend to do things like drug and alcohol test you. So they're not commonly appearing in your courts and having to be dealt with in those contexts. Doesn't mean we shouldn't look at them, doesn't mean we shouldn't update the law, but we should do it with an eye towards all facts that are relevant. And so let's take a look at another thing. The state of Nevada said, hey, we want you to pay net proceeds of minerals. And so it's like, after you do all the things you do, which is pay people, which is what we like, and after you do things like provide good health care and good retirement and all those sorts of things, we also say, we want you to pay a net proceeds. Well, you know, funny thing about net proceeds is when we have an eye towards increasing those taxes, it's like that's an automatic deduction from what their state net proceeds are. We should be mindful of what that does, because I'll tell you, as having served in the Nevada legislature, they'll go, whoa, if you're going to affect our income stream, we're going to go back and revisit that. Not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying we ought to know that before you enact something, which basically may say those 500 people working at that mine, extracting whatever the mineral is, may not have a job anymore. May not. I'm not saying, oh my God, the sky's falling. I'm just saying we should do that, with all these things with those things in mind. And let's talk finally about permitting. If a mine is seeking a permit in an area that doesn't pass NEPA muster, then they should be denied. The process is set up for that. But let's not start with the premise on permitting where it's like, oh, if you apply, you should have one. There are denials, and they should, quite frankly, be appropriate in some circumstances. But when we talk about refining what we do with minerals and minerals extraction on federal lands and elsewhere in this country, let's do so with a 360-degree look at all the issues and do it in a way that says if there's a part of it, and the final part is this. Nevada's a success story in reclamation. Doesn't mean mission accomplished. You never say that. It's a success story in reclamation. And so when we talk about what are we going to do with reclamation, and we're going to use some of these funds for that, let's also have our head on a swivel, because quite frankly, if it isn't broke in some areas, we don't need to spend federal money on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Amade, and welcome to the committee. I now going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to go first to Chairman Manuel. Chairman Manuel, we have existing laws in this country that are designed to protect Native American cultural sites. Why aren't those laws enough to protect the sites from the impacts of mining? Why aren't the existing laws that we have sufficient to protect cultural sites from the impacts of mining?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. The existing laws that are in place right now are good. But the problem that we encounter as we do consultation with the branches of the government, either they don't fulfill their authority and their responsibility in protecting those in our behalf. And so that's why we're glad to see the laws being changed now to give us that consultation that's going to be put in place as far as protecting, fully protecting these resources. Because right now, how we see it is the government does not really enforce that authority that they have on those entities.
Thank you. Mr. Comer, we've heard a lot about that if we move towards this leasing system, that it would be the end of mining or the sky in the United States. But other countries, such as Australia and Canada, have a thriving mining industry. In most of their territories, these countries utilize a mixed hybrid or a claims leasing system. Mining companies stake a claim until a discovery of a valuable mineral deposit occurs. At that time, these claims must be converted to a lease. Why should the United States maintain two different mineral development systems, both the locatable, which we're talking, and also leasable? We already know that Minnesota is a locatable system. Minnesota is not the leasable, but is a leasable system already.
That's correct, but there are no leasable mines in operation in Minnesota right now. Leasing has many issues. In hard rock mining, one of the issues is it's difficult to find mineralization that will yield a mine. The ability to have claims allows you to establish those locations over time and then develop them and even chase the mineralization. The exploration that was initially done in Minnesota was done in the 1950s and the early 1960s. Under a leasing system, you would not have your leases anymore. They would have devolved to somebody else.
To follow that question, in both Australia and Canada, which have been cited as examples, and they're countries that have thriving mining. They have a hybrid system, one in which you originally receive a claim. Once you strike, the hard rock, you discover that mineral, that then must be converted to a lease. So why is a lease a problem? Not a problem there, and yet it would be a problem here in the United States.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you'd have to look at how the system operates. Certainly, that's not what is described in this bill. This bill contains acreage limitations that would cause the forfeiture of leases. When we look at royalty...
Let me just follow. So you would be agreeable to a hybrid system such as what we find in Australia and Canada?
Mr. Chairman, it's not what I'm agreeable to. There's a group of, there's an industry out there that is very engaged in these issues. And I think you'll find the mining industry is eminently reasonable in how it views how it should operate. And those are discussions that may be appropriate to take up. But this bill does not contain a workable leasing system.
So it's the problem, and I'll just end now, is what's the specifics of this bill, not that you oppose a leasing system.
Again, no one really cares what I think.
Can we strike his entire record then? With that, I now recognize my friend, the representative from Louisiana, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Comer, I actually appreciate your testimony. I have a question actually for the chairman, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman, the sponsor of the bill.
Yeah.
Any chance? So I just want to make sure I understand the purpose of the legislation. You just feel that this is a public asset, the minerals that are being mined, and so you feel that the public should be able to have some type of value assigned to that and be able to benefit from that like we do for oil and gas and things along those lines. Is that accurate?
Essentially, yes.
And thank you, and that's the only question I had. I just want to make sure I understood that. Do any of you, and in fact, anybody in this room, I'm curious about the royalty rates. The royalty rates are established at $10 an acre on top of the 12.5, well, I guess the royalty rate's 12.5%. I think I saw there was a different royalty rate. Wasn't there an 8% as well? I'm just curious, does anybody know where those numbers came from? 8% of the value of production, and then not less than 8%, but then it's got a 12.5% threshold as well. But anybody know where those numbers came from? 8 and then 12.5%?
Representative, my understanding for the 12.5% royalty rate is the same royalty rate for oil and gas on public lands?
Okay.
Consistent?
So we have it based on oil and gas. And so there is some basis arguably, but then as we heard Mr. Comer say, that there are significant differences between oil and gas where you go in and extract from a large reservoir, whereas in this case, I think it's a different scenario, but at least there is a basis. So do all of you agree that if you have a public asset, a public natural resource that, and it's being mined or being utilized, that the public that owns it should get some type of compensation or benefit? Or does anybody disagree with that? Do any of you disagree with that?
I don't disagree, and I believe that it levels the playing field for hard rock mining industry with all other industries on public lands, oil, gas, coal.
Okay, and so in this case, under the legislation, 75% of the royalties or the revenues, they go into reclamation. They go into helping to clean up abandoned mines. That's correct, right? So I just find it curious that in this case, we're going to clean up abandoned mines whenever in other scenarios, there's strong efforts to make sure user pays or polluter pays, whereas in this case, this isn't necessary. This is disconnecting that. It's making other folks pay potentially for any type of environmental harm that may be caused. What are your feelings on the revenue sharing, where the states get 25%, the remaining revenues 25%? So none of this money is actually going to the Treasury. As I read, I think 100%. Is that right? 100% is going out because 75% goes to reclamation and 25% goes to states. So what's that? Federal tax is what? Well, you still get federal taxes, but of the royalties though. So do you believe that 25% should go to the states?
I believe if the states are left with the impacts of reclamation.
No, but let's go back and remember that 75% of the funds are going to actually do reclamation work, right?
Right.
So.
But the overall impact is going to affect the state. Yes, I do. I personally believe that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anybody disagree with that states should get some type of compensation? Okay, so the reason I bring this up, in Louisiana, when we dig, when we mine, we hit water, so it's not a whole lot going on in Louisiana. The reason I bring this up is this. So under the Mineral Leasing Act right now, states get 50% of the money from energy production, on federal lands in their states. They get 50% of the money, and there are no strings attached. They can do whatever they want with it. An additional 40% of those funds goes into the Reclamation Fund for water projects in the western states. So 90% of the money effectively goes back. In the case of where I represent, South Louisiana, we have produced maybe $200 billion in royalties and bonus bids and rental payments to the federal government, and we get virtually nothing. I think we got 0.6% this year. 0.6 percent. So Mineral Leasing Act gives up to 90%. Under this bill, they get 25%. While the environmental impacts are being addressed, we've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast and we get nothing, zero, zip. And I just find it interesting how this committee continues. Just last week, or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, we did a bill providing royalty sharing for offshore wind. I'm not sure what the environmental impacts of that are, but the territories are getting, under this bill, revenue sharing from offshore wind production. If we care about the environment, I don't understand why we have such disparity in our policies. So let me say, Mr. Chairman, I actually will support legislation. I don't know about the bill in its current form. I will support legislation that provides some type of value back to the taxpayer. I believe there should be something there. I don't know that these royalty rates are set appropriately. Maybe we auction it and see what the market determines. But I actually think the public should get something back, which is why not just the disparity, and I'm wrapping, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your discretion, not just the disparity on the lack of revenue sharing for Louisiana and states that produce offshore energy, but also I'm going to bring in red snapper. I'm bringing in red snapper in this conversation. All my friends up here, they love it when I talk about this. But here we have again, and you're going to cut me off now. Here we have again a scenario where red snapper is a natural resource. It is a public asset. It is a public asset, and we just give it away for free. Why is it that now some things are worth money and we need to have a market, make sure taxpayers are getting something back, and in other cases, we just give it away for free? I don't understand this committee, ever. We have no consistency in policy, and it's all about just choosing winners and losers. And in this case, in the case of red snapper, the public loses. The public gets completely screwed. So, thank you. I'm done.
I'm not sure I saw the exact relationship between the red snapper and this, but I appreciate.
You can't distinguish minerals and red snapper. They look identical.
I always
I would say
appreciate
yellow gold
my
versus rose gold.
representative from Louisiana kind of educating us. It's a pleasure. I'd like to thank the witnesses. Yes.
No.
With great honor, and I use that operative word as honor, that I represent the ranking member for 5 minutes. Ranking member
Well, first of all, just to correct the record with my colleague from Louisiana, it's not a 50-50 split. As you'll remember, a couple years back, it's 48. Yeah, the federal government stole 2% from the states. Just to correct a couple records here, Mr. Davis, do you take deductions on your taxes?
Of course.
That's what I thought. Let me ask all the members on the panel, do you have a cell phone?
Yes.
How about you?
Yes.
You have one? Mr. Comer, when we look at litigation situations, Canada's a little bit different than the United States, is it not?
Yes.
So what is that? I think it's English system, so what ends up happening, loser pays?
Yes, sir.
Oh, so it's a very, very different application here, and that's why we get the streamline effects in Canada, because we don't get the frivolous lawsuits, okay? Another thing I need to set straight. Chairman Manuel, thank you for coming. You talked about government-to-government consultation. Isn't it true that the government reached out to you and you refused to talk to them? Yes or no?
No.
Let the record reflect that they turned down government-to-government consultations numerous times with the Forest Service and with the company. So when we start talking about production, Mr. Comer, when we do rare earths in particular, I'm going to be very poignant about these. They're a little harder to deal with, are they not?
Yes, sir.
Hard rock's got some very, very different applications, does it not?
Yes, sir.
So what do we have to do with these that makes it, particularly hard rock, a little bit different than everything else?
Well, first of all, they're called rare earths partly because of how they're described, but they are very rare. They're located in very small quantities. They require extensive processing, and they're even more difficult to find, and yet their applications are essential to our current economic future.
So you saw the charts that I put up there. You know, we continue down this pathway. You see the bloom that we're more responsible or reliant on other forms of energy or of these minerals all the way around the world. How does that look to our intellectual property that's so much based upon these rare earths?
It's a challenge. We don't control any of the rare earths that are a critical part of our technology and energy resources that we're advancing that are advanced, that are not conventional in nature.
In fact, they have a monopoly, do they not?
An absolute monopoly, sir.
I mean, they actually they run the market, worldwide market, so that what ends up happening, they keep raising the price. Then it gets kind of advantageous for companies to come in, and once they start investing money, what they do is they flood the market, do they not?
That's certainly a possibility, sir.
Yeah, well, they do. Do you think the demand for these elements are going to go down, particularly with the less aspect for renewable energy and wind and solar?
I don't see any scenario in the short term where mineral demand will diminish.
So you made a comment that we would spend as much copper in the next 5 years as we did in the last 500.
25 years,
25
sir.
years, I'm sorry. Is that true?
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
Does new cars and electric cars have less or more copper?
A current electric vehicle uses 4 times the amount of copper as a conventional car, which uses substantially more than a car from 20 years ago. Just think of all the motors that exist in cars that have copper windings compared to the cars we grew up in.
So I'm going to go back to mitigation because it was brought up. Once again, Supervisor, just want to bring this up. You know, there is abandoned mines, but the problem with that mine, gold, was alluded to by the EPA. Their decisions, my wife is from Durango, by the way, so I do know a lot of people there. The problem for that spill was a catastrophe of errors, and particularly with what the EPA I didn't ask the question. That's fact. So when you look at these, Mr. Comer, as far as these rare earths, are they better done in this country or in China?
There are many reasons we're better off having minerals produced in the United States. Creates jobs, creates tax revenues. We do it in high environmental standards. There are a lot of benefits. In fact, you then control the market.
And one last question. When we talk about abandoned mines, part of the big problem with abandoned mines is litigation that prohibits us. We've been dealing with this on this committee over and over again. You know, for one in Arizona, we have Resolution Copper that mitigated a past mine site and have invested almost $1 billion in that reclamation application. There's plenty of groups that want to do that, but what ends up happening is the environmental groups will refuse to sign off on the litigation. That's part of the problem. And that goes back to my whole application that in Canada, they have a loser pays. So the frivolous lawsuits are few and far between. The last point I want to make is the reason why there are multinational companies is we put all the American companies out of business. That's the problem. In order to mine in the United States, you have to have holdings around the world to subsidize what you have to put through here because of the time it takes from discovery to mining is sometimes 20 years. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and the questions. I think we had a full discussion of some of the issues before us. Before I kind of summarize and end it, I'd like to ask the witnesses if there's anything that you'd like to provide, some concluding statement, no more than a minute, or some question that you wish you had been asked, either some concluding statement or some question that you wish we had asked that you want to ask yourself and answer it here. So, no obligation. If you want to answer it, you can. Is there anything you'd like to tell us now that we haven't asked you? Mr. Davis.
It's really not a question, it's just a thought. This mining law, which hasn't been touched for 147 years, needs to be overhauled. There's no question about that. I guess my question to you is, in my business, we sit once a year and we vision what the future looks like. If Congress, if a bipartisan Congress were to sit down and rewrite this law, vision this law, rewrite this law today for the future, what would it look like? And I can't imagine for a second that it would look anything like what's on the books now and what seemingly is ignored or passed away. We've heard how it needs to be worked on, it needs to be thought about. It does, and that's what today is about. Today is to begin that process. But if we were writing this this law today fresh, if Congress was rewriting it, what would it look like? And I think that's my question to Congress, to a bipartisan Congress.
Thank you. And anyone else wish to make any final statement, concluding statement, or ask a question that we haven't? You, Mr. Davis, asked us a question. Yes.
Members, thank you for this opportunity. Companies put hundreds of millions and billions of dollars into opening mines. If they don't have security of mineral tenure, it's not a true investment if you're subject to losing that. With respect to how we look at royalties, if you look at the profits pie in mining, there's not 12% of a gross royalty. There's generally not 8%. There's less than 3%. So the royalty issue is important because mineralization, hard rock mineralization is difficult to find. It's expensive to process. If you look at a typical copper mine, you dig hard rock, you crush it, you screen it, you grind it, you mill it. Then you only have 30% copper. And you may have had transportation steps. Then you send it to a smelter to get to 80%, and then to a refinery. It's very expensive. So these are small deposits. They're not regional deposits. The exploration is challenging. So when you look at a royalty, it's important to look at what royalty number are you using, how are you applying it, where are you applying it, and does it make sense for the mineral? So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and mining is not one-size-fits-all. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. Chairman Manuel.
Just want to state that I do understand the purpose and the intent of copper mining that's being done on our nation's lands and the benefits out of the mining. But I just wanted to say that we would rather have consultation so we can mitigate the negative impact it's going to have on us. I did meet twice with the U.S. Forest Service director there in Tucson, and I met twice with the Corps of Engineers that's overseeing the project on the 404 permitting. So we had those meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lackelt.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to start by just reiterating this law is almost 150 years old, and we desperately need a source of funding to be able to clean up the 500,000 abandoned mines. This bill would provide for that. It would ensure that no community would have to go through what my community went through with the Gold King mine spill. And even though the EPA was working, trying to fix the mine, it was inevitable that that mine was going to blow out. And we could experience another mine blowout at any point. So we very much need a source of funding for that. I'd also like to respond by stating that the industry on federal lands enjoys exemptions from many of our laws that protect water quality, the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And in terms of NEPA, you know, it doesn't apply in terms of they can't select a no-option alternative. So this reform would also give communities input into the kind of development that may or may not be appropriate in their backyards. And I believe that every community needs a say, and not just to be forced, have a mine forced upon them in their watershed. And also, folks really want to make sure that they're sourcing their minerals from mines that practice best practices, and it's about responsible mining. We don't want to source our minerals from companies that can destroy an entire watershed for a community. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would like to offer one concluding thought after listening to both the panelists and also to the members of the behind the dais. It's clear, and from the arguments from both sides on this issue, and what was stated, I think, quite eloquently by the representative from Louisiana, our hard rock mining system needs to be fixed, I think. The mining industry knows this. They're scared of changing the existing system, but they also have made it clear that the existing system that we have today is not ideal. Meanwhile, even though I do agree that it would be good to reduce our dependence on imports, or that the importance of finding new deposits of minerals here in the United States that we need for our new clean energy future, I can't support doing that under the mining law of 1872. I think what I'm saying is that there's a win-win to be found here. We need the mining industry to come to the table to find that win-win. And unfortunately, we haven't seen much appetite on their side to want to come to the table to do that. But I believe there's a way to reform the mining law, protect special places as been identified by respecting tribes, that we can clean up abandoned mines and solve some of the problems that the mining industry faces. But I think we're going to need to all work together to do that. So in conclusion, I want to just say that the members may have some additional questions that they may want to ask you, members of the panel, and we'll ask you to respond in writing to requests. Members will have, under our Rule 3.0, members of the committee may submit to the witnesses here questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for you to respond to those questions. If there's no further business, and not hearing any, this committee stands adjourned.